Hi, everyone. My name is Daniel Folko, Anita M. Stein-Treber curator, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you back to the Curator's Den, a monthly program in which we look at different aspects of the collections at the Washington County Museum of Fine Arts. And I hope you will join me today in resuming our discussion of some very interesting Egyptian art objects in the museum's collections. And this is a continuation of a video that I did last month. This program is sponsored by Mr. and Mrs. Lee Stein, and today we're going to continue that discussion. And for those of you that have not had a chance to see part one, I encourage you to have a look at it because it touches upon some of the related material that we're going to be discussing today. And today we're going to look at a group of amulets that date from the late period of Egyptian history and culture. They're quite intriguing, and it will provide us with a window onto the ancient gods of this civilization. Just as a quick recap, ancient Egypt is a polytheistic culture and society in which the worship of gods and pharaohs as actually deities, was very important. It's a civilization that stretches back millennia, many thousands of years. And they are most famous, for example, in the Old Kingdom period for these pyramids that you see pictured here of the different pharaohs, as well as the Sphinx that we see here on the right. They created very elaborate statues in addition to monumental architecture that depicted these ancient kings. And what's key to the ancient Egyptian society is not only the belief in the gods, but also that there is this aspect of life after death. And there's this almost obsession in Egyptian history and culture with trying to make sure that the deceased have the best possible preparation for entry into the afterlife. Some of the most important gods in the ancient Egyptian pantheon include the sun god Ra, also Osiris, whom we're going to be looking at today, Maat, goddess of truth, justice, and harmony, and Osiris there is god of the dead and the ruler of the underworld. You also have Anubis, who is the god of embalming the dead. This aspect of embalming and preserving dead bodies was very important, as we know, in terms of ancient Egyptian mummification practices and rituals. And just as a review here from last time, ancient Egyptians believed that those spirits of the dead during a very important ceremony were going to be separated from the body but remain alive in the afterlife. And these pictures and diagrams show you how the soul, the person's soul or personality known as the Ba, would leave the body but continue on in the afterlife. So these are some of the important principles to keep in mind. We know about ancient Egyptian civilization because of the all famous Rosetta Stone, which is in the British Museum in London. And French archaeologists in the early 19th century, after the Napoleonic expeditions and invasions of Egypt, were able to decipher the ancient hieroglyphs that are shown on the upper part of this by comparing them with demonic and ancient Greek scripts below. This provided one of the keys, if not the key, to understanding, being able to read the language and the customs of ancient Egyptian sculpture, as well as scrolls, often created on papyrus in their time. And that helped to unlock the understanding, to be able to read their language. It was critical. And this was really important in terms of being able to uncover some of the historical information about this past civilization. It was critical to be able to read those hieroglyphs. Without that, the archaeologists weren't able to understand what all of those monumental creations meant, including important inscriptions within temples, on sculptures both small and large. Bringing it back closer to the Washington County Museum of Fine Arts, we explored last time how the Singers established a pillar, if you will, at the museum for the acquisition of ancient Egyptian art through the donation of this statuette that we looked at last time. Back when John Richard Kraft was the director during the 1940s, the Singers made this gift initially in 1949 to our museum. This laid that cornerstone. The acquisition of ancient Egyptian art and Mediterranean artifacts continued by director Bruce Etchison in the 1950s, and that would culminate in 1958 with the acquisition of a group of Mediterranean objects, as they were referred to as that at that time. It included these that are shown here in the annual report from 1958. And also, importantly, as you can see here, 24 Mediterranean cultural objects. And then in our bulletin, these are also acknowledged here. We looked at some of these last time, and we'll continue on. Ancient Egypt being one of the ancient Mediterranean cultures. So let's go to this very interesting eye. And I should say before I launch into this that the pieces we're looking at today are primarily, if not all, from the late period of ancient Egyptian history and culture. The late period is a time of great upheaval in Egypt. It is a time in which Egypt will no longer be a nation as it existed in the past that is independent of foreign influence, foreign domination. You will have a series of invasions beginning with the ancient Assyrian peoples, those peoples that originate in what's today Iraq. You will also have an invasion of the Persians that's going to occur. The time period we're looking at is the 8th century BCE, roughly all the way down through the 4th century BCE. It will continue on under subsequent cultures. It will be conquered by Alexander the Great in the 300s BCE, and that's going to continue down through the Roman conquest. So this is a time of great change in ancient Egyptian society. And what this caused was artists and artisans to look to the past, to earlier Egyptian dynasties for inspiration. And sort of you have this remarkable boom of artistic production, particularly these small scale objects that we're looking at today. And these would have been produced in large quantity in the period that we're looking at. So we begin with something that's quite intriguing, and this is called a wedjat or wadjet eye or amulet. These works that we look at today, amulets, were abundant in the period, and they were very probably inexpensive. So some of them that we're looking at were not necessarily commissioned for royal patrons or aristocrats, and that made them nearly available to everybody. An amulet is an object believed to have certain positive properties that can magically be bestowed upon owners. Some of these amulets would have been worn while people were alive, and in many cases, they would have been buried with them when they died. Thereby, the belief by the ancient Egyptians that they would accompany those persons into the afterlife. Often, these amulets were pierced or featured a loop, which allowed them to be used as pendants, as rings, or as necklaces. And sometimes they were even incorporated or unfolded into pieces of fabric that were attached to strings and also placed with sarcophagi, with mummies. So they had multiple functions in ancient Egyptian society, the main one being as an amulet to ward off evil. The wedjat eye that we're looking at here represents the healed eye of the god Horus. Now, Horus is very important as he was the god of kingship and the sky in ancient Egypt. This is what he looks like in his color form here, taken off of ancient Egyptian reliefs that would have been elaborately painted. He carries an ankh in his hand, a life-giving symbol in ancient culture. And as you can see here, he has the head of a falcon. But interestingly, that word wedjat or wadjet also refers to an ancient Egyptian goddess. She was the goddess protector of all Egypt, Wadjet. And her symbol was a sacred cobra, also known as Uraeus, emblematic of supreme power and often worn by deities and also sovereigns. So you can see here in her representation, you'll see that a lot with ancient Egyptian gods and goddesses, is that they take on the characteristics of different animals. And very importantly, we see here this symbol of the god, the Eye of Horus, shown here in its hieroglyph form. So I want you to keep that in mind as we go backwards here and look at the piece itself. We have a bunch of layered symbolism. Two gods, as I mentioned before, you've got Horus and you've got Wedjat. But this word Wedjat or Wadjet, however you want to pronounce it, in ancient Egyptian means the one that is sound again. That is, that it's this idea of the soul becoming one in the same, so to speak. And originally in ancient Egyptian mythology, Horus's eye was injured It was believed to have been stolen by God, the god Seth, who is the god of war and chaos. And then it was restored to Horus by the god of wisdom and writing, as well as the dead and hieroglyphs. His name was Thoth. So basically, this eye is given back to, it's restituted to Horus. And Horus has a special connection to that goddess Wedyat or Wadyet, because uh, she and Horus were closely connected. She was said to be the nurse of him when he was an infant. So many of these gods have these interrelationships, and they went through many different trials and tribulations. So the symbolism is often very complex in terms of how it's layered. And you can see here how the eye, according to the hieroglyph, has been sort of adapted. But as it rolls up here, we sort of see the abstract edge of a snake, which is kind of interesting. And it also bears that resemblance to the actual symbol, hieroglyph. It's interesting, though, that it has the three holes. And when we showed this to a colleague by the name of Regina Schultz, who's an Egyptologist and the director of the Römer Pelizaeus Museum in Hildesheim, Germany, she was a bit puzzled by it, and she concluded that this likely did not come from an earlier dynasty, but probably was from a later period, in which the artist who produced this may have been of mixed ancestry, that is, Egyptian or Persian or perhaps Assyrian ancestry, and therefore perhaps was not entirely familiar with all of the symbolism, thereby mixing it, combining it all together into one piece. And the other thing that's puzzling is these kinds of works often will be combined into a ring. They take on a very different kind of form. Usually it would look something like this. This is an amulet ring of the same symbolism from the earlier dynasty. Ours, though, is most likely a pendant that is connected to a necklace and worn as such. Here are some examples of different Wedyat eyes with that uraeus, and you can see how different the Hagerstown example is from the others. These much more closely conform to the hieroglyph. And there you can see the cobra itself, the uraeus, that snake, juxtaposed against Horus's eye. So they're quite diverse in terms of their representation. Many of them are made out of colored faience, sometimes mixed together with other natural organic matter, sometimes also with steadite, and then fired to achieve this blue color. So they are quite diverse. And according to the tag on the bottom of this piece, it's said to have been from J.P. Morgan's collection originally. And there it has the identification, at the time thought to be the 19th dynasty because of the style. But with the mixing of all of these different motifs, we bring it to a later time period in ancient Egyptian history. Whether it is actually was part of Morgan's collection, we don't know. That would take further research. But in any case, it makes for a very interesting subject. And you can see how this one that's in the Metropolitan Museum of Art from an earlier dynasty does share those similar elements. Now, as a quick recap, looking back to the last time that we were discussing the ancient Egyptian art, it conformed to a series of proportions, of a certain kind of rigidity, if you will, stylization. And this is called the canon of proportions. And we looked at this in terms of how sculptures were produced. Canon, a set of artistic or aesthetic standards, values, or guidelines. And the ancient Egyptians would use these grid systems to create each individual figure. For relief sculpture, like you see here with the very famous palette of King Narmer from the pre-dynastic period, and that ranging all the way to papyrus scrolls that show various Egyptian deities here in a judgment image of souls, in this case, a man named Hunefer, before he goes to the underworld, dating from about the 19th dynasty or 1285 BCE. We looked at how this related to the statuette that the singers gave us, roughly from the 13th dynasty or late Middle Kingdom, also in our collection. And how also the canon of proportions, hierarchical or hieratic scale, would have governed the creation of a piece like this, a Shabti figure of the Privy Councillor Ahmose Nefer Sakhmet, also faience, and dating from 30th dynasty from this late period. As we continue on, we see how these proportions applied to even other small scale pieces. And Osiris, as I mentioned before, he's the god of the underworld. He's a very important deity, and his key attributes are his flail, which is called nekaka in ancient Egyptian language. He also holds a short-handled crook called a heka, or scepter, usually in his right hand. So he has both of these attributes. He also wears something called the Atef crown, consisting of the upper Egyptian white crown flanked by two lateral plumes, and again the uraeus, or the snake, is also, the cobra is woven in here. Now the example in our museum is a little bit worn down, so it's harder to see this. But if you zoom in, you can make these out. You can see the ridges of his crown here. And also on the back, we have this pillar that's holding up his body, which is called a deyed. Starts at the base and it typically finishes at his chest. You also have the use of the rounded suspension loop, meaning that this could be fashioned and worn as a necklace, or it could be suspended or strung perhaps within a shrine. And as a comparison, here, you can see this one that's in the Harvard Art Museums a bit more clearly, also with the suspension loop and those very important attributes that I showed you before. This is what Osiris looks like when taken off of ancient Egyptian reliefs and restored to then contemporaneous colors. You see those attributes that he has, the white crown, etc. So he takes on different forms depending on which context we're looking at him. But over time, Osiris became very important because he became equated with all deceased individuals. Therefore, he became a symbol of resurrection. You had the construction of a major occult shrine for the god at Abydos in Middle Egypt, where that statuette that the singers gave us likely originated, built under Pharaoh Seti I between 1294 and 79 BCE, which is one of the most magnificent temples to be put up in that area in the 19th dynasty. And you can see how our example is very similar in many regards. You also see his beard that's extending down below his chin, which is also a feature of many pharaohs who dress in this fashion. You have an abundance of these works that are being produced at the time. And here are just some examples of others that were formerly on the art market. You see the Deyed pillar here, the loop. They follow a similar kind of pattern. Here you get a better sense of the god's features, and also how the cobra or uraeus is pulled into this design. I should mention that during the late period, you also had a considerable interest, a passion that developed for the god Osiris. So many of these objects were produced by the thousands during this late period, 760 to 330 BCE. The one that was on the art market corresponds very closely to our example as well. Those outstretched ears as well, the crown, and his scepters. So it's very interesting to do comparison of these and see the different types that existed. This is one that's, if you go down even later into what would be the Greek period, almost down to the Roman period. And sometimes very abstractly represented. In other cases, you have more detail. Depends on which one you're dealing with. From there, we move on to another important deity. And this is Isis, who was believed to help the dead after, once the deceased had their ceremony, to enter the afterlife. So she's basically an assistant goddess to help the deceased go to the next world. And according to the Osiris myth, she actually resurrects her slain husband, the divine king Osiris, whom we just looked at, and she produces and protects his heir. And the heir, you could probably take a guess, is Horus. So she has a very close relationship with both Osiris and Horus. And what the sculpture represents is Isis holding the infant Horus. Her maternal aid is invoked often in ancient Egyptian ceremonies of healing spells that are intended to benefit ordinary people. She was also considered the divine mother of all pharaohs. And she has many different attributes to her that you can see, though a little bit battered and worn down on this example. She often is seated on a throne, like you see here in our example. She wears a tight fitted garment and a tripartite wig surmounted by a crown of a uraeus. Once again, there's a solar disk, there are cow horns, and oftentimes her right hand is pushed off to her side, supporting the infant as he sits on her lap. This was one of the most influential myths in the ancient Egyptian world. It follows a very long story. Basically, it's said that Osiris's brother Set, god of war, was jealous of his success as ruler of Egypt, and so he murdered him, tearing his body to pieces and then scattering it. But in despair, Osiris's wife and also sister, Isis, collected his severed pieces and restored Osiris, allowing him to posthumously conceive his son Horus, who once grown finally avenged his father by killing Set. And of course, very importantly, Isis would heal and also care for the young deity Horus. Again, we have a suspension loop that's included with this piece. Originally, this would have been much more brightly colored and decorated. It relates to this example that's shown in the upper right, where you can see some of those attributes of hers a little bit more clearly. Ours is done in this faience that kind of has taken on a green coloring. Others were done in blue. And here's a close-up of that particular piece. This is what the two look like side by side. This is once Horus grows older, grows up. This is what Isis looks like. Note, they're both holding the ankhs in this instance. This is another side view of the sculpture. Give you a sense of it in the round. And here's another example. So these were produced, like the others, very frequently. They would have been placed in tombs and other shrines. This one, though, has hieroglyphs that spell out a dedication to the patron who commissioned it. You see the similarity with ours. And here is one that was done around in the same late period that shows more distinctly in the Metropolitan Museum how the baby Horus looked, and as she nurses him, and these different elements of her elaborate head garb. So you have a great deal of diversity in the depiction of the deities. From there, we look at briefly the sculpture of the god Nefertum, which literally might mean beautiful one who closes, or one who does not close. In ancient Egyptian language, he is a god of renewal. And originally, he was credited with the creation of the world and very closely associated with lotus flowers. Nefertum also was believed to have first delivered sunlight and a delightful smell of the Egyptian blue lotus flower, having arisen from primal waters within an Egyptian blue water lily. That's why the color blue is so important in many of these pieces. Our example, though a bit worn, relates closely to other similar pieces, such as this one over here. He also has an elaborate headdress. This one is in the Walters Museum. Importantly, he's also eventually seen as the son of the creator god Ptah, and also the goddesses Sekhmet and Bast, sometimes are called his mother. And this is what he looks like if you were to see him on a colored relief with all of his attributes. And you can see the similarity between both examples here. This one, not necessarily an amulet, more a statue perhaps that would have been placed in a shrine. And from there, we move to a piece that's also interesting in terms of its mythological content. It's a Thoth ibis. And we had talked before about the god Thoth, god of wisdom, writing and hieroglyphs, also science, magic, art, judgment, and the dead. He's often depicted as a man with the head of an ibis or a baboon. In this case, from the relief, we would see him with the ibis, the bird, but also sometimes as this primate, a baboon. And here he is with the goddess Ma'at. And Ma'at played a vital role in ancient Egyptian religion in terms of being an arbiter. That is, she judged balance, order, harmony, and morality. So therefore, she's basically a justice goddess. So she has a significant role. And in many cases, she is seen as his counterpart. And that's why the two are shown very close to one another, Thoth and Ma'at. They both have this very important connection as deities of wisdom. And in this case, they are often represented as the piece that we're looking at here together. In this case, we have Thoth not in, if you want to say, human form, but as the actual bird itself. And then crouching down below, you can see right here, is Ma'at. This was a very common practice at the time for the two in the late period to be sort of pulled together within the same statuette. She's almost in this crouching devotional pose, and he's shown nursing her. This shows you the piece in the round. And a very similar example, in some ways almost nearly identical, some differences in the St. Louis Art Museum, in which we can see the details of the bird's beak. Suspension loophole, again, very important. And here's another one that was formerly on the art market, in which the god is shown as crouched with a feather of Ma'at instead of the figure of Ma'at. From there, we go to and look at a very interesting ancient Egyptian scarab seal. And as I talked about this last time, we'll come back in a moment, scarab beetles are very important in ancient Egyptian culture because they're seen as a life-giving and a regenerative force. And you see that connected, of course, as we were talking before about Nefertum and the importance of lotus petals, the color blue. All of this relates to the life cycles and the continuation of life, and particularly for the ancient Egyptians in the afterlife. You can even see here the blue paint that's flaked off of this bronze seal that we have. So the scarab is this sacred insect in ancient Egyptian religion and culture. Now, according to Dr. Schultz, bronze scarabs are actually very rare. Based upon the decoration of the back and the design of the base that we're looking at here, it's most likely from the Second Intermediate or New Kingdom period. And that would roughly be 1550 to about 1292 BCE. It has a hole here, which suggests that it may have been actually worn as an amulet. And you might ask yourselves, what would a piece like this have been used for? In the most mundane sense, a royal and official institutional use for record keeping, sealing up letters, being distributed to private persons and families, marking personal property, and defining the position of that particular individual within society. However, sometimes during other dynasties, they were worn as amulets with different hieroglyphs on them. Here are a couple of comparable examples that we see here. Sometimes they bore the name of the individual. This one in the Israel Museum, for example, has the name of this individual, official name Ahmose. However, ours would need a bit more research to try to determine what exactly this means. But in their most mundane sense, they would have been used to seal those documents, probably at the time with wax. We also have a few of these ancient Egyptian seals, and these were produced using steadite, and then you would have the inverse of the image placed on a clay tablet in miniature. And here's an example shown here in this slide that is very similar to this, attached with a rope to show the connection between the two pieces. Again, serving that very same function. Often inscribed with the owner of or the individual, and they would essentially press the underside of the seal into that lump of clay that would bear an impression of the incised decoration. And this is a close-up of that picture of a similar Stedite scarab seal amulet. These also being, again, scarabs, except not bronze. Now, before we conclude, I just wanted to introduce a little bit of museum historical trivia that I found in our archives, and it was actually quite intriguing to learn about. Back in 1933, this archaeologist by the name of Dr. James Beveridge came to deliver an evening lecture at the museum. And Dr. Beveridge, while I couldn't find out a lot of biographical information on him, I was able to find out that he was originally a professor at the Tome School in Port Deposit, Maryland, which is in Cecil County. And today the Tome School still survives. However, it no longer conducts classes in this building, which unfortunately suffered a fire in 2014. But anyway, getting back to Dr. Beveridge, he originated from Britain, and he secured a job for some years teaching at the Tome School in history and also geography. He was a skilled archaeologist and also an authority on the arts and literature. He was a member of the Maryland Academy of Sciences in Baltimore and an academic senator and chairman of archaeology at the academy. So he was invited, no doubt, from our director at the time in 1933, Richard Medford, who was a fellow Baltimore archaeologist trained at Johns Hopkins University. What's really neat is he came that night in 1933, which I believe was the springtime, and he discussed the then not so much in the distant past excavations of King Tut's tombs. And Dr. Beveridge produced a number of popular articles based upon those excavations. Whether he actually took part in the excavations of King Tut's tomb, I don't know. But according to the article in the Herald Mail, he was involved with certain work and digs in ancient Egypt. But King Tut is very famous to us today, a very important ruler of the 18th dynasty of ancient Egypt. And very likely, Dr. Beveridge presented photographs of the excavations done in 1922. And here we see a photograph of Howard Carter and one of his assistants examining the innermost portion of King Tutankhamun's sarcophagus in 1922. Of course, there were all kinds of stories and legends that emerged from this. Not long after this, Dr. Carter would actually die, but it was related to health problems when looking at it scientifically. But there developed this lore of the curse of King Tut's tomb. And this is one of the most famous parts that was excavated, was this mask that was placed on top of his sarcophagus made of gold, lapis lazuli, and other precious pigments and jewels were found in there, including this pectoral decoration. Notice, nice way to sort of wrap up our program today, the sacred god of Horus, the uraeus, the Wedyat, also the all-important scarab beetle, and then the lotus petals. All this comes together with the Ankhs and is very much connected to the important symbolism and imagery we've seen today in our presentation. So with that, I will conclude. I thank you for joining me, and I hope that you can come next time as I discuss the world of Japanese ukiyo-e, or woodblock prints, as we look at several examples from the collection here at the museum. Thank you again, and I look forward to seeing you again soon.